Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming to the Wallenberg Advocacy Group at McGill University Faculty of Law's inaugural event. My name is Jeremy, and I'm the Wallenberg Advocacy Group's director. Our group's mission is simple: give voice to the voiceless by taking up the cases and causes of imprisoned human rights defenders wherever they may be and engaging in legal and public advocacy on their behalf. En faisant ceci, nous cherchons à créer une communauté de défenseurs des droits de la personne, non seulement à la Fac de droit de McGill, mais partout au Canada. Donc, s'il y en a parmi nous à d'autres facultés de droit qui aimeront créer leur propre groupe d'action Wallenberg, écrivez-nous pour qu'on puisse réunir et apprendre ensemble comment mieux soutenir les causes qui nous tiennent à cœur. Today, we're here to shine a protective spotlight on Dr. Wang Bingzhang, who has languished in solitary confinement for more than 18 years. His only crime is defending democracy. Last week, the Wallenberg Advocacy Group published a white paper detailing the violations of not only international law, but also Chinese constitutional and criminal procedural law perpetrated by China's government in persecuting Dr. Wang. Anchored in our white paper, today, we're sending an open letter signed by 6 former ministers of justice and foreign affairs to China's foreign ministry, calling for Dr. Wang's just release. Published today in the National Post is our op-ed, where our white paper and open letter are linked for those who are interested to take a look. To talk about this and much more, we're very lucky to have with us today Bing Wu, Dr. Wang Bingzhang's brother, and Dr. Wang's children, Times and Tiana Wang. As well, the members of parliament who have adopted Dr. Wang's case and cause, who represent each major federal political party, and I'll introduce them now. We welcome the Liberal member from Humber River, Black Creek, former Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, the Honorable Judy Sgro. The Conservative member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, and critic for international development and human rights, Garnett Jennis. Le député du Bloc québécois pour Lac-Saint-Jean et porte-parole pour la francophonie internationale et la coopération internationale, Alexis Brunel-Duceppe. The NDP member for Edmonton Strathcona and Deputy House Leader and critic for international development, Heather Mcpherson, and the parliamentary leader of the Green Party and member for Saanich Gulf Islands, Elizabeth May. Speaking after them is McGill's very own professor of law and expert in international public law, Professor Frédéric Maigret. And finally, we're very lucky to have Dr. Wang's international legal counsel, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and Emeritus Professor of Law, Erwin Kotler. We'll be concluding with a live Q&A, so please feel free to write any questions that come to mind in the comment box on your screen's right. Without further ado, Bing Wu, the mic is yours.
Thank you, everyone, to be here and to act on my brother's behalf. My name is Wang Bing Wu. I'm the younger brother of Dr. Wang Bingzhang. And I have extremely the honor to be here to share the story, which is a sad story of my brother, Wang Bingzhang. I want to thank everyone here, especially the Member of Parliament, and also the Right Honorable Elizabeth May, whom I met a few years ago, and its law student, and a special gratitude goes to Dr. Erwin Kotler. Now, you might know from the public media about my brother already. However, I'd like to share some greater detail about my brother. Okay. There are 5 siblings in our family. My brother Bingzhang is the second one. We are actually born from a very ordinary family in China, and nothing so special about my parents, and they are just ordinary workers. However, through various huge events that happened in China in the past half century, more or less, where my brother have gone through, and those events for example, the Cultural Revolution, for example, have changed my brother's mind. He was lucky enough to keep his thought until he came aboard and come to McGill University to do his experimental medicine in a PhD degree. Now, almost to the day 38 years ago, in September, on the day that he graduated and with his PhD degree, at the night, he asked me to sit down with him and asked me plainly, he said, Brother Bingwu, what do you think I should do? I'm the first one to obtain the PhD degree since the Cultural Revolution. I just did that in a record speed. What do I should do? He asked me plainly. I said, dear brother, you can go back to China with this degree and with your talent and with your medical skill as a surgeon, you can do a huge thing back in China and become a great surgeon, and then you have a great future. Or you can stay here and with Western PhD degree and with your experience and your wisdom, you can develop yourself with huge career to be a famous doctor here, famous surgeon. And he said, Bingwu, no, that's not what I'm trying to do, and that's not what I'm going to do. I said, what do you want to do? He said, I'm going to give up my medical career. I'm going to devote myself into pro-democracy and the justice for the people of China. And he continued, I'm a surgeon. I could cure a few people with my surgery knife. I can remove the tumor. But right now, I'm going to pick up a revolutionary surgery knife and cut all the diseases of the nation. That's what he said to me. I right away, it was totally surprise to me, of course. And I said to him, I have 100% support to your goal. And I know you can success. However, keep in mind, my dear brother, this route is very difficult. It's full of thorns and hurdles. And you could put yourself in, your life in danger. And he told me, Bingwu, I'm already prepared for it. I know how difficult it's going to be go through this route, but I'm so determined. I will go this for the people of China. That was the story. And then from that point on, for over 20 years, he did nothing but that, pursuing his goal, his ideology. And he did that by formed a couple of opposition party. And for that reason, he was really hated by the CCP. In 2002, he was kidnapped and abducted, blindfolded, and into China, and then sentenced for life shortly after that. Life in prison. For the last 18 years, my dear brother has been in solitary confinement. So I'm here just to plead the members of parliament and Elizabeth May, yourself, and also the party leaders, and every one of you, and every one of you in front of the television or in front of Facebook. to do whatever thing you can do to get my brother out. And I believe with effort, every one of us will be succeed. With that, I thank you again.
Thank you very much, Bingwu, for your remarks and sharing with us your brother's story, the story of a truly courageous man that I know I personally look up to and very much admire the sacrifices that he made. So thank you. Next, we'll hear from Tiana Wang, Dr. Wang Bingzhang's daughter, who herself graduated from McGill Law in 2014, and she'll be sharing with us her experience advocating on her father's behalf. Tiana.
My name is Tiana. Thank you to the organizers for putting this event together, to the parliamentarians for joining us, to Professor Maigret and Professor Kotler for your relentless efforts in supporting my family, and to the audience for participating today. So just small correction, I completed my law degree at McGill in 2017, and I'm currently working in Toronto. Before I started law school, I spent most of my early adulthood dedicated to working on my father's campaign, in some periods of that time, full-time. It started largely after I completed CEGEP. I took a gap year before starting my undergrad at McGill. And I didn't really have a plan other than I wanted to bring attention to my father's case and to organize a campaign on his behalf. At that time, it had already been 7 or 8 years into his imprisonment. My family had already spent a lot of time and energy trying to release him, and we were just getting really desperate. So I decided that I was going to pursue this myself full-time after CEGEP. So I moved to Washington, D.C. At the advice of some other Chinese activists who were active in the advocacy community, and basically spent a year there trying to get the American government to advocate for my father's release and to bring attention generally to my father's plight. I did pretty much anything and everything to try to raise awareness on my father's behalf. So I spent a lot of time cold calling, cold emailing various elected government officials, even walking around government buildings and physically knocking on doors. I wrote articles, did countless interviews, and spoke at numerous conferences and other events organized by human rights organizations. The connections and the experience I gathered in DC allowed me to continue advocacy on my father's behalf, and I spent several more years doing public advocacy trying to secure my father's release. I did this throughout my undergrad and also took some more time off between undergrad and law school to pursue this. Throughout this, my efforts or my main goals were really to try to get the American and the Canadian government to intervene on my father's behalf. Specifically, one of the things that my family believed and still believes is that my father's freedom really depends on the personal intervention of heads of state. So for years, my efforts were really focused on trying to get President Obama, Prime Minister Harper, and Prime Minister Trudeau to become aware of my father's story and to intervene personally on his behalf in private discussions with the leaders of the Chinese government. As you can imagine, that was a very difficult goal. In some ways, I was able to accomplish quite a bit, mainly by raising his profile among the hundreds, if not thousands, of imprisoned political dissidents in China. And at certain points in our campaign, we were able to engage at pretty high levels of government in Canada and the US. And one of the more meaningful things that I was able to do was to organize with other children of imprisoned Chinese activists and coordinate our advocacy efforts to bring attention to human rights issues in China. My family was also really fortunate that our story and my efforts were able to generate quite a bit of public interest, and I was able to share my father's story on some pretty interesting platforms. And his story also got featured quite a bit in the media, not just in the news, but through a fictional novel and a documentary. Ultimately, though, my father remains imprisoned to this day. And as a result of my own outspokenness, I haven't been able to enter China or visit him for over 10 years. When my father was first imprisoned, and even when I started advocating on his behalf, I don't think I or anyone in my family really understood how powerful the Chinese Communist Party is. Never did I think that 18 years later, my father would still be imprisoned after everything my family did to try to win his release. It's been personally quite devastating, and it's difficult to describe in words how hard it is to feel hopeful about the situation. So two things I try to remind myself is, well, for one, I try to take comfort in the fact that history tells us that no sacrifice for just causes is wasted, and that progress is a cumulative effort. So while not all of my family's endeavors will have dramatic results, I do believe that they move us in the right direction. It's also important to me and to our family that people know about my father and his work, and that so that his imprisonment isn't in vain. I think that if my father's work inspires others to organize to fight for democracy in China, I'm quite certain he would sacrifice his freedom many times over. So for that, I'm very thankful to you all today for giving me the opportunity to share my father and my family story.
Thank you, Tiana, for those moving remarks. And I think I speak on behalf of not only myself, but all those tuning in, that your father has indeed inspired us to mobilize for all cases relating to justice and democracy. So thank you. Next, we'll hear from Times Wong, Dr. Wang Bingzhang's son, who will discuss Canada-China relations.
Thank you, everyone. So I thought I'd actually focus my remarks on sharing my reflections on the meaning of the kind of work we're all doing here today as human rights advocates and lawyers, and how it relates to the situation in the People's Republic of China right now and the rule of law. So first, so I wanted to share some high-level thoughts on how we frame the discussion. And I would urge everyone to reject the framing of this issue as China versus the West, and to embrace the framing of this issue as the CCP versus democratic values. Because China versus the West is a frame that the CCP advances, and if we fall for it, it's not just it's a propaganda coup for the Chinese government. Not only that, I think it's just false, because whatever the West means and whatever Western means, ideas like laws should be impartially applied are not unique to it. So that's one thing I would urge everyone to think about when they engage with the PRC on these issues. Now, it is true that the PRC does not have the rule of law. How do we know? Well, in 2018, Xi Jinping orchestrated the amendment of the Article 1 of the Constitution to enshrine the leadership of the CCP above all. Now, if you talk to PRC officials, which I'm sure people on this call have, they will sometimes insist that they do have the rule of law, that things are done according to law. But there's a very simple question you can ask them that disproves that. You just have to ask them, well, isn't it the case that the party, not the written law, is the highest authority? The only true answer is yes. Now, what does the lack of the rule of law mean for cases like my father's? Well, it means that the Chinese legal system provides very limited recourse. Now, I say limited, but I don't say zero, because if you think of law as a promise that a society makes to itself and to others, pointing out, as the white paper does and as we continue to do, pointing out the repeated breaking of these promises is embarrassing, and it has value for us as advocates. Now, we shouldn't kid ourselves, of course. The lack of the rule of law means that it's a very hard and long road in advocating for cases like my father's. We are bound by principles and values that the CCP is not. All we really have in the face of their power is reasoned argument, while they are not even bound by basic things like facts and evidence. But here's the thing, despite that asymmetry, we should never let ourselves be tempted to abandon those principles and values out of expediency. So for example, in my father's case, it's tempting to get out there and accuse the Chinese government of having kidnapped my father. But the reality is we don't have hard proof of that. So the best we can responsibly say is that he was kidnapped by Chinese-speaking agents who we suspect were working on behalf of the Chinese government. Now, adhering to these principles and values is, of course, costly and difficult, but I submit that principles exist for difficult times, not for easy ones. If you only stick to a principle when it's easy, well, then it's not worth very much. So how do I think about how this relates to being a human rights lawyer and advocate? Well, it's hard. It can be just tedious, digging through a long and voluminous factual record for the right citation to make sure you get the facts straight, looking for the right precedent to support an argument, all that is very tedious work, as you all know. And there are temptations to cut corners sometimes. But I would urge you not to do that and to realize that what you're doing in that moment is practicing the rule of law. You're practicing a way of life built on principles as opposed to the arbitrary exercise of power. Now that may feel thankless, but I'm saying to you right now as a fellow citizen, lawyer, human being, not to mention someone who might be described as your client, I'm saying thank you. I'm saying keep up the good work. To paraphrase the Canadian poet Dennis Lee, we do this kind of work because we believe we live in the early days of a better world. And it is in the very process of doing this work by which a better world is being created. Thank you.
Thank you, Times, for joining us today and reminding us of the importance of standing up for our principles and indeed, as you put it, practicing the rule of law. And one of the best places to practice the rule of law from is Parliament in Ottawa. C'est pourquoi le groupe d'action Wallenberg travaille en cause commune avec le caucus parlementaire multipartite Wallenberg pour les droits de la personne. Et nous sommes très chanceux d'avoir avec nous aujourd'hui 5 membres de ce groupe qui ont adopté la cause du Dr. Wang Bingzhang. First up, speaking, we'll have the Liberal MP, the Honorable Judy Scruggs.
Thank you so very, very much. And thank you for the opportunity to participate in this very, very important conference today. Listening to the family members, I have to say, of Dr. Wang is really heart-wrenching. I don't know how they've managed to go so many, many years continuing the campaign. The atrocities that China continues to get away with is really, it's more than unfortunate. It's immensely terrible that they manage to continue to violate people's human rights. People like Dr. Wang, who are just doing the right thing and standing up for democracy for many of the people. I was at a press conference with Minister Kotler in 2003 when we first raised the issue of Dr. Wang. And that's been some years back. And hearing Tiana and the other family members, it really brings back home what part of our role as parliamentarians is that we have voices on behalf of Dr. Wang and others that are unjustly being persecuted and detained for so many, many years while we suffer. The courage of the family matches the courage of their father and their brother. Clearly, they care very much, and I want to thank them for the great work that they're doing by keeping his case alive, and to McGill for the great work you did on the white paper. I hope that that might be the one piece of additional evidence that will showcase just how terrible this, the persecution of Dr. Wang is in solitary confinement. And I would just ask that we all keep Dr. Wang and the family in our prayers, and the others who are being kept for absolutely no reason, that we continue to attack China and call them to account for the kind of human rights violations that they do, whether it is for Dr. Wang and the others, or the two Michaels that we currently have being detained as well. There's just so many, and it's just so unfair and unjust. So I'm glad to have a voice in Parliament. I will be raising Dr. Wang's case in a statement in the House. It's the first opportunity that I have, and we will continue to work with the Raoul Wallenberg group that I'm part of, the founding member, until we actually get justice. And justice would mean Dr. Wang being free. And we'll all hope and pray that that happens. So thank you again for the opportunity, and God bless everyone.
Thank you very much, Ms. Judy Scrow, for joining us today, for putting your name on Dr. Wang Bingzhang's case and cause, and for putting forward soon a parliamentary statement in Ottawa. Next speaking, we have the Conservative MP, Garnett Genis.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be part of this important conversation, and I want to thank the Royal Wallenberg group, Dr. Erwin Kotler, and I particularly want to thank and salute the family members for your courageous statements today, and assure you of of our Conservative caucus and of our leader Erin O'Toole's support for Dr. Wong and for the advancement of human rights in China and around the world. Just a couple comments that I'd like to add specifically in terms of what's been said. First of all, I think advancing freedom and democracy in China is an urgent priority. We need to work with and support strong voices like Dr. Wong's, and do all we can to promote the advancement of democracy and human rights in light of two major developments: the escalating abuses of human rights in China. Much has been said recently about the genocide of Uyghurs, and that's happening alongside a crackdown against all faith communities, other minority communities, and against everyday Chinese people who wish to be able to express their opinions, to speak openly about what their government is doing, and to be able to challenge and push for better within their own society. But also the second development I think we need to be conscious of is the efforts by the government of China to spread their political model around the world, the escalation of those efforts, and how that presents a real and pressing threat not only to the human rights of Chinese people in China, but to people all around the world. And we're hearing more about, for instance, the intimidation here in Canada of those who speak out about human rights abuses in China, especially those with family members back in China. We're hearing about efforts to suppress discussion and debate about these important issues. So again, real and pressing issues that we have to confront directly. I want to also specifically just pick up on the importance of the comment made about not framing this as a question of China versus the West. I think there are some on both sides, both here and in China, especially the CCP, that want to frame this as sort of a difference of cultures, or a clash of cultures of some sort. We have to, I think, firmly reject the cultural argument for authoritarianism, and appreciate the fact that Chinese people desire freedom and democracy just like people everywhere. We hear some voices that try to tell us that authoritarianism is sort of compatible with China's Confucian culture. This is dead wrong, and we see flourishing democracies that have been shaped by Confucianism as well in places like Taiwan and South Korea, and we have to note that democracy activists they draw on China's own rich culture, traditions, and values in their defense of freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. This is not about a clash of cultures. Rather, this is about peoples in all nations needing to recognize the threat that is posed by the CCP to our security, to our way of life, and to the lives and dignities of people and security of people like Dr. Wong. And the final comment I wanted to make is that I think this case brings to the fore as well the important role of Canadian universities. Much has been said, and I think rightly so, about the financial exposure of Canadian universities to Chinese government influence, about the risks of monitoring of, for instance, Chinese students that are on Canadian campuses, and of the challenges to our universities and the need to confront those issues. But at the same time, I think Dr. Wong's own experience at McGill as an alumnus of McGill is very important in showing the opportunities that we can provide to those who are advocates of freedom and democracy to be able to come and study in Canada and then benefit from the connections that those things provide. So I want to invite and challenge Canadian universities really to recognize the role and the opportunity that they have to support students who come from abroad in being able to engage with Canadian values and be able to develop their own desire for political reform and use ideas that they're freely able to explore and develop here in Canada to then pollinate their own societies with, and that requires universities to be courageous in protecting the freedoms of all of their students, including international students, to explore ideas without monitoring or intimidation. So again, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak at this event. I want to salute the courage of Dr. Wong and his family, and add my voice to others on this call today who are calling for a concerted effort to advance freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in China and around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Garnett-Jennings, for your remarks and for joining us today and for indeed adding your name to those who are fighting for Dr. Wang's just release. Maintenant, nous avons la chance d'accueillir député pour le Bloc québécois, Alexis Brunel-Duceppe.
Merci tout le monde. Est-ce que vous m'entendez bien? D'abord, je veux remercier tous les gens qui ont organisé ce webinaire. Je veux remercier tous ceux qui y participent aussi, mes collègues du Parlement ainsi que M. Cutler. Mais surtout, au nom du Bloc québécois, je veux réitérer mon appui à la famille de Wang Bingzhang. Ça fait, on le sait, plus de 18 ans que le Dr. Wang est détenu sous de faux prétextes. Et c'est difficile de s'imaginer ce que peuvent ressentir les proches d'une personne qui est emprisonnée injustement. Donc, je veux le redire encore, nous sommes au Bloc québécois de tout cœur avec vous. On appuie fermement votre travail pour faire libérer votre père, votre frère. Votre persévérance au cours de toutes ces années-là est impressionnante et ça a de quoi inspirer toutes les personnes qui militent pour la justice, pour la démocratie. Évidemment, on sait que ce n'est pas quelque chose de facile. On a vu comment ils ont tenté de vous empêcher de parler au Comité des droits de l'homme. On a vu comment ils ont essayé de vous espionner, de vous intimider. On a vu comment comment ils tentent de faire taire leurs critiques. D'ailleurs, peut-être même que certains participants ici ont déjà subi des pressions ou du harcèlement en rapport avec leur implication dans le cas du Dr. Wang. Mais c'est clair, il ne faut pas céder à ce genre de tactique-là et on doit continuer de défendre les droits de la personne et la démocratie en Chine, comme partout ailleurs dans le monde d'ailleurs. La cause du Dr. Wang, c'est celle de la démocratie. Elle est juste, cette cause-là. Au Bloc, on pense que la Chine doit libérer le Dr. Wang Bingzhang, mais aussi tous les prisonniers politiques pacifiques, et on pense que le gouvernement du Canada se doit de l'exiger. Ici, au Québec, les citoyens peuvent s'exprimer sans crainte de représailles dans un processus démocratique. On est chanceux d'avoir ce droit-là et bien d'autres qui est garanti par nos lois. Le Dr. Wang a pu constater lui-même l'importance d'une société démocratique lors de ses études à McGill. Il était même présent lors du référendum de 1980. Prenez ça de la bouche d'un indépendantiste, parce que je peux vous dire que peu importe l'allégeance, qu'on soit de droite, de gauche, au final, on partage tous les mêmes valeurs démocratiques de respect mutuel et de tolérance. C'est ça qui nous permet de débattre avec passion, oui, mais surtout de trouver des terrains d'entente. C'est ça la démocratie. Et il n'y a pas de raison pour que les citoyens chinois ne puissent pas en jouir au même titre que les Québécois et les Canadiens. Avant de conclure, j'en profite pour inviter les étudiants présents à continuer à s'intéresser à la vie publique et aux questions de droits de la personne, ici comme à l'étranger. L'implication politique, c'est essentiel au maintien d'une démocratie en santé. Et à la famille du Dr Wang, ben, lâchez pas, on est avec vous, on veut vous aider et votre courage, votre persévérance sont exemplaires. Donc, merci beaucoup, merci énormément pour l'invitation. Je suis très heureux d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui et on lâche pas, on est avec vous. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Alexis Brunet-Duceppe, pour vous avoir joigné à nous aujourd'hui pour nous aider à promouvoir les droits de la personne en Chine, mais aussi partout au monde. Now we'll hear from NDP MP Heather Mcpherson.
Let's see. Can you hear me now? Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me and letting me take part on this panel. I just wanted to echo many of the sentiments that my colleagues have said before me, and I do want to start by acknowledging the incredible strength that Dr. Wang's family members have demonstrated for nearly 2 decades now. Bing, you have defined what brotherhood means for all of us. Your commitment is outstanding. Times to listen to you speak, you've distinguished yourself as a human rights advocate, as a lawyer and a writer, all while fighting to free your father. Tiana, you've become an amazing advocate yourself, not just for your father, but for the freedom and democracy of so many people. I know that you all pay an incredible price every day for your work, and I want you to know that I admire your strength and your determination very, very much. As a mother, I know that despite everything your father is going through, despite everything your family is going through, I can only imagine just how proud your father must be of all of you for the work you do. I also want to take some time to thank the McGill family as well, the family of students and professors who have come together. I've worked for human rights and international development organizations for most of my life, and I know how important it is to have these families on our sides, our own families, our families of colleagues who work alongside us as we create change, and the families of people like those on this call. We cannot forget Dr. Wang. As you know, as all of the people on this call know, Dr. Wang was an exceptional person. Even as a young man, Dr. Wang resisted the powerful forces overtaking his country. But as Canadians, we are proud to say that his commitment to human rights and democracy was forged right here in Montreal. As such, Dr. Wang is a part of our family as well, the Canadian family, and we must, as a nation, do everything we can to free Dr. Wang. Thank you for letting me be part of this panel. I'm here to tell you that I will do everything in my power to support you, to free your father, and to free the other political prisoners being held in China and throughout the world. I will work with my colleagues that are on the call with us today, and I will also work with colleagues in the NDP party. Thank you very much again for letting me join you, and we will not forget Dr. Wang.
Thank you very much, Heather Mcpherson, for joining us today and for rightly insisting that Dr. Wong is indeed part of the Canadian family, the Canadian nation. Next, we'll be hearing from the parliamentary leader of the Green Party, Elizabeth May.
Thank you. I thank all of my colleagues for being here together. I look forward to being with you in Ottawa to take up this cause in person directly on the floor of the House of Commons. I speak to you today and acknowledge I'm on the traditional territory of the WSÁNEĆ people, the Indigenous people of this area, the Coast Salish Nation. I want to say how deeply moved I am once again to hear your words on behalf of Dr. Wong, your family, your speaking as a brother, speaking as daughter and son of someone so courageous. It's deeply, deeply moving. I was first engaged to pledge support, that we would never forget, that we would work to see his release. Of course, I was, as I think probably all of us were, recruited by our friend and colleague, the Honorable Irwin Cotler. Honorable is usually used as an honorific. It is an honorific, and in some cases, it is more true than ever. That's in the case of the Honorable Erwin Kotler, who has stood and with the Raoul Wallenberg Institute stands so strongly that we never forget people who are wrongly imprisoned for standing for human rights. Where we are now, and I can't begin, when I think of 18 years and I think of what he suffers in that prison, whether he even knows from day to day how many voices there are around the world calling for the People's Republic of China, for the Communist Party of China to see its way to reform and change, to allow those voices of democracy to speak freely and not to be jailed. We think of Michael Kovrig. We think of Michael Sparvor, Canadians arrested and imprisoned in a tit-for-tat gesture that is unbecoming any nation that wants to ascribe to the rule of law. We think of the pro-democracy movement within Hong Kong, and the Green Party of Canada and our Green Caucus stands in solidarity with the people who are facing arrest now in Hong Kong for standing up for democracy and for their agreement with the People's Republic of China, which is being violated. So those of us in Parliament who stand with you do so with this deep sense of humility. When you tell the story of your brother, when you talk about your young brother giving up a career, a safe life, with a conscious awareness of the sacrifice he was about to undertake, 18 years in prison may seem impossible, but I don't believe that anything is impossible. As unlikely as it will seem to us today, how unlikely was it for those who were waiting and hoping and praying and advocating for Nelson Mandela after 18 years, who would have imagined he'd be released after 27 years and go on to be president of his nation? Nothing is impossible if we refuse to accept being told that there are only certain things that can happen. And we will continue to advocate and work with, and it's an honor, a deep honor to work with you. And it's a deep honor to speak with my colleagues today. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Elizabeth May, for joining us today, for adding your name to Dr. Wong's cause. We are all, including Dr. Wong, the beneficiaries of your tireless advocacy. J'aimerais remercier les députés qui sont adoptés la cause du Dr. Wong. Vous faites vraiment un travail essentiel. Ancrant notre travail collectif sont les arguments juridiques de la cause de Dr. Wong présentés dans notre livre blanc. Pour souligner ceci, nous avons le professeur Frédéric Maigret.
Bonjour à tous et merci Jérémy pour cette invitation. C'est un grand honneur. On m'a demandé de parler en français aujourd'hui, de parler du docteur Wang Bingzhang et en 3 et 5 minutes, essayer de vous faire un résumé des enjeux juridiques de sa situation. Je voudrais juste commencer en disant que le docteur Bingzhang était bien un docteur et ça n'est pas innocent de mon point de vue. Il est docteur de l'université de McGill et c'est une blessure toute particulière pour la communauté que je représente et que représente mon estimé collègue Erwin Kotler, que l'un de nos plus brillants étudiants soit emprisonné et nous nous sentons redevables de sa situation et exprimons à ce titre notre solidarité avec lui et sa famille. Je parle ici de la faculté de droit d'où émane cet effort grâce au centre Wallenberg et au groupe d'action. Et je voudrais tout particulièrement saluer nos étudiants qui font un travail excellent et je reconnais que comme souvent en tant que professeur, je vais me reposer sur les analyses de mes étudiants telles que formulées très intelligemment et avec beaucoup d'éloquence dans le livre blanc qu'ils ont soumis et qui résume très bien les enjeux. Et finalement, je voudrais dire que je parle comme juriste à propos d'un dossier qui est sans doute avant tout un dossier humain, un dossier politique, mais qui a aussi une dimension juridique. Le droit, surtout les droits humains, c'est un langage commun que nous pouvons tous parler et qui permet justement de transcender les différences autour de valeurs communes et notamment de dépasser cette opposition tout à fait artificielle entre la Chine et l'Ouest. Je note que la Chine a ratifié de nombreux instruments internationaux en matière de protection des droits humains, a voté pour la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme. Et le droit fournit donc un langage d'objectivité, un langage autour duquel on peut réellement avoir une conversation au-delà de ces différences. Alors, je vais résumer en très peu de mots. Il y a des procès injustes et puis il y a des parodies de justice. Hein. Un procès injuste, c'est un procès qui est éventuellement entaché par un délai excessif ou peut-être le fait qu'on n'ait pas été notifié de son droit à avoir un avocat assez vite. Et puis, il y a des parodies de justice, et là, je pèse mes mots, c'est-à-dire des processus où les violations ne sont pas incidentes, elles ne sont pas banales, mais elles touchent à l'essence du procès équitable. Et en réalité, elles touchent à l'essence du procès tout court, c'est-à-dire qu'on se demande en définitive si on a vraiment affaire à un procès, sans même parler de savoir s'il a été équitable ou pas, ou si c'est juste une apparence de procès, une mascarade. Et là, je vais égrener des faits qui sont connus, mais qui rappellent, qu'il est important de rappeler. Détention incommunicado de M. Bingzhang, qui surtout n'a pas le droit, avant son procès, d'accéder à un avocat qui ne connaît pas les charges retenues contre lui, à qui on dénie le droit de parler à son propre procès. Tout ça, ce n'est pas des ornements procéduraux, c'est des droits qui vont au cœur même de la justice d'un procès. Et puis, on lui nie depuis des années un accès à ses avocats après avoir été condamné à une peine particulièrement sévère. Et je voudrais ajouter à ce titre qu'il y a aussi un élément qui est important, c'est que les conditions même dans lesquelles il a été amené en Chine à son insu, en violation de toute garantie procédurale liée à un traité d'extradition, sont problématiques et dans d'autres systèmes judiciaires pourraient mener à sa libération comme seul remède équitable. Il est important dans tout ça de souligner que, bien sûr, il y a des violations des standards internationaux et on pourrait continuer d'en parler, mais il y a aussi une incapacité du système judiciaire chinois à live up to its ideals et à respecter certaines normes qui, je dirais, au moins sur le papier, sont garanties. Et ça, c'est important pour les juristes de pouvoir pointer ces contradictions entre les principes que la Chine entend appliquer idéalement et la réalité de cette pratique. J'ajoute bien sûr que le Centre Wallenberg est loin d'être le seul à cautionner cette analyse juridique, et notamment de manière très importante le groupe de travail sur les détentions arbitraires, qui est un groupe très important au sein des Nations Unies, a à plusieurs reprises entériné cette analyse et déploré l'ensemble du processus au terme duquel M. Bingzhang a été détenu. Et on est bien remarqué, pour le groupe des détentions arbitraires, la question n'est pas de savoir si son procès a été équitable ou non, c'est presque plus grave. C'est-à-dire on est face à une détention arbitraire, c'est-à-dire quelqu'un dont la détention ne fait pas sens et n'est pas cautionnée, ne pourrait pas être cautionnée par le système juridique. Et puis, pour finir, je voudrais dire qu'au-delà des violations de la procédure, on le sait bien que le résultat souvent des violations de la procédure, c'est qu'on rend une mauvaise justice. Hein, et que donc, il n'y a pas d'un côté les violations de la procédure et de l'autre côté la question de savoir si on a condamné un innocent ou un coupable. C'est que le meilleur moyen de condamner des innocents, c'est encore de ne pas respecter la procédure qui a été instaurée justement pour respecter la présomption d'innocence. Et là, on est bien face à une énorme erreur de justice, toute banale, c'est-à-dire qu'il y a fondamentalement une erreur sur la personne, une erreur sur les faits, et je crois que cela a été abondamment cautionné, comme on le voit d'ailleurs dans plein d'affaires pénales aux États-Unis, par la rétractation de certains témoins a posteriori, de personnes qui sont revenues sur leurs déclarations, lesquelles avaient formé la base des accusations portées à son encontre. Et donc, derrière tout ça, je pense qu'une fois, when all is said and done, on se rend compte qu'il ne reste pas grand-chose derrière ce procès, si ce n'est l'hostilité avérée du régime au travail du Dr Wang en faveur de la démocratie et des droits humains, et que c'est là l'expression d'un pur arbitraire. Et puis, pour finir, je voudrais quand même souligner un fait qui a son importance, qui concerne les conditions de la détention. de notre collègue, confinement solitaire, dont plusieurs organes en matière de protection internationale des droits humains affirment depuis quelques années déjà qu'il s'agit au minimum d'un traitement dégradant et inhumain, si ce n'est lorsqu'il est prolongé et particulièrement cruel, une forme de torture. Et je remarque à titre de comparaison que même sur Robben Island en Afrique du Sud, qui n'était pourtant pas un camp de vacances, Nelson Mandela avait le droit à la compagnie d'autres prisonniers. Il avait le droit de continuer ses conversations, sa formation dans la dignité, alors même qu'il représentait assurément un risque objectif pour le régime de l'apartheid à l'époque. Et donc, je voudrais souligner le caractère atypique, inhumain de cette détention à l'isolement sur une durée aussi longue avec les conditions physiques et psychiques que l'on peut imaginer. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Professor Mcpherson, for joining us today and for briefly summarizing the long list of violations, not only international law, but also Chinese constitutional and criminal procedural law perpetrated by China's government in persecuting Dr. Wang. And as we discuss Dr. Wang's unjust persecution, remembering, as you mentioned, that the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention twice, as well as UN Special Rapporteurs, held that Dr. Wang's detention was unjust, it's important to remember that Dr. Wang is not alone. Indeed, he serves as a looking glass into the countless others unjustly imprisoned by China's government for doing nothing other than fighting for democracy. To talk about this and the Communist Party of China's massive domestic repression more broadly, we're very lucky to welcome Emeritus Professor of Law and Dr. Wang's International Legal Counsel, Erwin Kotler.
Thank you, Jeremy. May I begin by expressing my respect for the family of Dr. Wang, for their moving remarks today, for their steadfast courage and commitment to the case and cause of Dr. Wang Bingzhang these past 18 years, and indeed for the pain that they've had to endure during his unjust incarceration. I want to express my appreciation to you, Jeremy, to Nick, and through you both to the entire McGill Student Wallenberg Group for the initiatives you have undertaken, the white paper organizing the letter signed by 6 former ministers, and in particular for convening this initiative today, as the whole reflected as well in an excellent op-ed in today's National Post. Je voudrais aussi exprimer mon appréciation à mon collègue et ami, le professeur Frédéric Regret, pour son engagement et son leadership dans ce cas. And saluer aussi les députés qui sont parmi nous who have taken up Dr. Wang's case and cause. The first all-party parliamentary conference on behalf of Dr. Wang was actually, as mentioned, held in 2003, the same year that the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention held then. And this is, we're now saying 17 years ago, that his detention was arbitrary and illegal, that the charges were unfounded, that his continued detention was a violation of international law, and called for his release and to be reunited with his family. Indeed, Dr. Wang Bingzhang can be said to be the founding father of the Chinese democracy movement. And I mentioned that because I think the framing, as it was suggested by Hassan today, is correct, that it should not be seen in terms of the West versus China, but the CCP versus democracy. And that was Dr. Wang's commitment to democracy for the Chinese people as part of a global, if you will, democracy movement. But that desire for democracy led tragically to his imprisonment, and which, as Jeremy said, can be seen as a looking glass into the CCP's massive assault on the rules-based international order, to the resurgent global authoritarianism that they personify and which Dr. Wang anticipated in his initiatives on behalf of democracy then, and which today include the targeting, and I'm using the words of the CCP itself, the targeting of what they call the 5 poisons, the Uyghurs, the Hong Kong, the Falun Gong, Taiwanese and Tibet, the mass atrocities against the Uyghurs, which include not only mass incarceration and slave labor and torture and starvation in concentration camps, but include also mass sterilization, forced abortions, separation of children from their families. In a word, what we are talking about, and then includes also the massive assault on the culture, identity, religion of the Uyghurs. What we are talking about here are not only crimes against humanity, but acts which are arguably constitutive of genocide, as set forth in a brilliant paper by Yona Diamond, our Wallenberg Center's legal counsel, and Rehan Asper, who is the sister of an imprisoned Uyghur, and where they set out the legal case in full. But it includes also this assault on the rules-based international, the prosecution and persecution of the Falun Gong, the national security legislation, which criminalizes not only the democracy movement in Hong Kong, but all those who wish to support it outside of Hong Kong, where China has emerged, and this is not all that well known, as the leading jailer of journalists in the world today, in a massive assault on press freedom, where it includes the illegal organ pillaging and harvesting, particularly from targets like the Falun Gong and the Uyghurs, and the large number of political prisoners, including those with a Canadian connection. We have the imprisoned Canadian Chinese Uyghur Hussein Salil. We have the Falun Gong practitioner Sun Quan. We have the Canadian businessman Zhao. We have the 2 Michaels, has been mentioned. And indeed, the 2 Michaels who were imprisoned as part of retaliatory hostage diplomacy by the CCP for Canada exercising its international obligations under an extradition treaty. Yet the CCP referred to what Canada did as being vile, unconscionable, and evil. In other words, acting according to international laws, Canada did, was characterized as being vile, unconscionable, and evil. But what is vile, unconscionable, and evil is the unjust imprisonment and continued torture and detention of Dr. Wang Bingzhang. What is vile and unconscionable and evil is refusing to allow Tiana Wang, after she made the trip to China with her infant daughter, to be able to see Dr. Wang and to be turned cruelly away. What is vile, unconscionable, and evil is this massive assault continuing as we speak on a rules-based international legal order. So may I conclude with a number of initiatives. Number 1, we need to renew on an urgent basis a petition to the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. Number 2, make representations to the UN specialized agencies and special procedures, including also the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, the UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism, all of whom are engaged in the illegal torture and imprisonment of Dr. Wang Bingzhang. We need to make representations to the UN Human Rights Council. China, as we meet, is a candidate for election to the UN Human Rights Council. The mandate of the UN Human Rights Council requires that all those on that council protect and promote human rights. It's astonishing that we should even be considering a massive violator of human rights to be able to be a candidate for election to the UN Human Rights Council. And the case and cause of Dr. Wang Bingzhang should be used as a looking glass, to use Jeremy's words again, to expose and unmask, in effect, the illegality of their candidacy. Number 4, we need to internationalize the parliamentary advocacy. Tomorrow, Garnet Jennis and myself will be co-chairing a meeting of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance of Parliamentarians Re China. We are going to ask all the parliamentarians from some 25 democracies to take up the case and cause and internationalize the democracy. Number 5, to make direct representations to Chinese authorities, particularly in the form of legal briefs. Number 6, Magnitsky sanctions to be imposed on all those involved in the unjust imprisonment, torture, and detention of Dr. Wang Bingzhang. And finally, engage civil society, engage leaders, the kinds of things that the family themselves have been doing in our continuing efforts, in a word, to secure justice for Dr. Wang Bingzhang, to secure accountability for the violators, and, as been mentioned by the Wang family, to bring about a better world through the case and cause and justice of that case and cause of Dr. Wang Bingzhang. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kotler, for your poignant remarks and tireless advocacy. There is indeed much work to be done, and as many of us know, it's law students and lawyers who have a particular responsibility to do that work, to get into good and, unfortunately, all too necessary trouble, as the late John Lewis would put it. We must remember that when students unite, our voices are indeed heard the world over. And we must also remember that the Wallenberg Advocacy Group is recruiting 5 more junior advocates, and our application package will be available on Monday on Facebook. So please stay tuned for that. We now have prepared a few minutes for a live Q&A. We've been receiving questions from our viewers, and if our participants would allow it, we can ask a few now, because I do appreciate that we are running a bit late due to our unforeseen technical difficulties at the beginning. We have a question from or for Times or Tiana. The question is, as lawyers and as the children of Dr. Wong, what are the advantages that your legal education has given you in advocating for your father? How does your identity as family members complicate how you approach your legal advocacy?
I'll share some thoughts. So one thing that it really helps with is clear thinking. Is we're breaking down the issues in clear, logical, reasonable way. And when I go to China and I talk to PRC officials, when I go visit my father, it's the conversation often devolves into a debate about the merits of the CCP rule versus democracy. It's actually quite funny because I never bring it up. It's almost like they bring it up with me out of like guilt or shame or something like that. And one thing it helps me do is just, engage in that verbal sparring with them effectively. So for example, the point about rule of law. I mean, those of you who have dealt with PRC officials in any capacity or, for example, with the 2 Michaels, you know that this is a refrain that PRC officials like to say. We do things in accordance with law. We have a rule of law. But, the example I gave about just ask them, well, which is the higher authority, the party or the written law? And the answer is, of course, the party. And in one, exchange, you have demolished their argument. Now, does that mean the 2 Michaels are going to be free or my father's going to be free? Of course not. But it is important to push back on those kind of nonsensical rhetorical arguments that they make. So that's one way it's helped me.
Great, thank you for that response, Times. Very insightful. We have another question from a viewer, and this question is open to anyone who'd like to answer it. The question is, what can we as civilians do to support the movement for Dr. Wong's liberation?
I guess I'll volunteer to answer this again. I mean, just being on calls like this is a good first step because, describing it as shining a protective spotlight is absolutely accurate. I mean, we know from experience that the Chinese government pays attention when others pay attention. In fact, I have had PRC officials, prison officials, complain to me about press coverage of my father's case. They'll say, it's not true. Like they pay attention. So when you pay attention, they pay attention. And so that's, that's an important first step. Tiana, I saw you unmuted yourself. Did you have other thoughts?
Well, one thing that we've always invited people who wanted to participate to do is to write to their elected official to bring, to have them to bring awareness to my father's case to their representative. And some other things that we have done is ask people to write, write directly to my father in prison, even though he probably can't receive those letters. Again, it's just, shining, it's bringing the fact that the prison is aware that there is people concerned about him around the world, like you framed it earlier, does shine a protective spotlight on him. So we really believe, there's been an Amnesty chapter who's been writing cards to my father for, almost 2 decades, and even though he's never received one of those cards, I firmly believe that they've, those cards have that awareness of his case from the West has, safeguarded his life. So, directly writing to my father, directly writing to parliamentarians, and to the Chinese embassy even, just to make them aware that there's people who are watching and who care.
And maybe I'll take this opportunity to share some internal scuttlebutt, shall we say, or analysis of how a case like my father's actually works in an authoritarian regime. So, and bear in mind, this is speculation, since of course it's a closed system and closed regime, so we don't really know. But essentially, what we have been told by people who have contacts in the Chinese government is that a case like my father's is so politically sensitive that the only way there can be forward movement on it is if there's a directive from the very, very top, which is why, as Tiana mentioned, we have been, one of the specific policy asks we've been trying to secure is really like a head of state to head of state personal intervention. Because this is a system where a politician and a government official's loyalty is not to a constitution or to a set of ideals, but their loyalty is to people, is to other people, to the party. And even if there were a middle level, provincial official who thought that this was, a case of injustice, there's no way they would touch it. There's no way they would touch it because it could put their own careers at risk. So there's, so this is why, pressure, international pressure and attention is so important.
Thank you very much, Times and Tiana, for answering that question. I'm afraid, given that we are trying to be respectful of our speakers' times, we only have time for one more question. And this question is directed to you, Professor Kotler. In your opinion, what is Canada's role in promoting human rights and democratic values, both at home and abroad?
Well, Canada likes to say that it not only has a human rights foreign policy, but it has even a feminist human rights foreign policy. In other words, that it is at the forefront of the pursuit of international justice, but it will be judged not only by what Canada says and affirms, which is important, to the declarations are important, but also by how it acts in pursuit of those objectives: the promotion and protection of democracy, the pursuit of justice and accountability, and taking up the cases of political prisoners, which end up being, at the end of the day, really a case study of both the pursuit of justice on the one hand and accountability of human rights violators on the other. So I would hope that the Canadian government, along with the Canadian Parliament, would take up the case of Dr. Wang Bingzhang, as Times just mentioned, at the highest level, and make the representations at the foreign minister and prime ministerial level directly to their Chinese counterparts, because we have to understand that the violations of the CCP, of their international treaty obligations, are effectively violations being committed against Canada, which is a state party to the same treaties, whether it be the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights or otherwise. So if we are going to protect and promote justice and international law, then when we have standing violations of these international treaties by the CCP, where we are a co-signatory, we have an obligation to bring this and to make these representations, lest our silence is interpreted as some form of acquiescence. So Canada will have to, I think, begin to do more at the highest levels in making the necessary representations in the pursuit of justice, for which Dr. Wang Bingzhang's case is a dramatic case study.
Thank you, Professor Erwin Kotler. And with that, we'll unfortunately have to close our event. I'd like to thank all the speakers who joined us, namely Dr. Wong's family. We stand with you in spirit and in solidarity today and every day, and we will not relent until your father is freed. We thank the MPs from each major federal political party who joined us today. We look forward to working with you in common cause for many years to come. I thank all members of the Wallenberg Advocacy Group and the Royal Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. And if there are any law students listening, which I'm sure there are many, please write to us, join us in our fight for justice. Thank you for coming. Be well and be kind.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, everyone, for this very meaningful event.